Hi, Carl Sakis here, agency consultant, and welcome to Agency Office Hours, live Q&A here every month. This is the Agency Office Hours for October 2021. We'll be answering a number of questions about growing your agency more profitably. Here's a preview of what is coming up. Nick in Washington, D.C. has a question about sales prospects who ghost. Maria in Nova Scotia has a question about how to prevent client scope creep. I'll have some advice about benchmarks around how much to pay yourself as an agency owner. Adam in Oregon has a question about how much to share with the team about agency finances. And finally, John Mark in Oklahoma has a question about the handoff from the sales team to the delivery team. We'll be answering all of those today. If I mention your questions, be ready to join in. If I didn't mention you, but you have a question you'd like to ask, feel free to include it when you RSVP for a future event. We have all of those available to RSVP free of charge on the Sakis and Company website. As usual, we are recording office hours today, so don't share anything out loud that you don't want to become public, just in case. And if you're joining live, you'll get the recording within 24 hours. And if you're watching the recording, well, you have it instantly. All righty. First up is Nick. Nick, if you want to get ready to come on camera. All righty. Well, Nick, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on.
Absolutely. So to paraphrase, here's the question you asked, and then we'll dig into the answer. So you asked, how do we stop getting ghosted by sales prospects? You mentioned that when people reach out, they seem interested. And then once they see the proposal and or hear more about the pricing, suddenly they disappear. You are not alone in facing that problem. If you could share a bit more about what you're experiencing, and then we'll work on helping you solve it.
Yeah, so, we're a full stack marketing agency focused on B2B. Based in Washington, D.C. Our structure is retainer-based, mostly. So when we have, when we kind of initiate the sales process, we have these calls with prospects. Usually it's the first call is kind of get to know each other, requirements gathering, get to kind of feel each other's style. Usually the first call goes great. They're excited about what we can do together, about the opportunity for growth, and they ask for a next step. And in the past, we've done presentations. We would prepare a presentation, have a call, present, and kind of get into the weeds. That didn't work as well. We were getting ghosted back then.
They would skip the presentation, or you do the presentation and they disappear?
We would do the presentation, and then at the end of the presentation, so this would be the second call.
Yeah.
It would go great. They would ask, okay, send us a proposal. We would send the proposal, and then we would get ghosted. What we started doing instead to kind of shortcut the process is we started essentially looking at the packages on that second call right away.
Got it. And question with the packages. So, agencies can provide custom or productized services or some combination of both. And Kate, if you don't mind sharing our article on custom versus productized, that'll be helpful. So it sounds like you mentioned with packages, your services lean more toward productized. Is that correct?
No, I would actually say it's a little bit more custom. I mean, we have buckets of services, but the packages are usually organized in the kind of the traditional 3-tier structure. Silver, gold, platinum, if you will.
Yep.
But a lot of I think the services are not necessarily productized services.
Okay. Well, the main thing though is that you're giving them an idea. Now that does raise, do you know enough about them by that second call, or even if you do the second call and do the proposal after that, do you know enough about them and their problems and their situation to advise accordingly? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. Mm-hmm. Have you explored doing something like paid discovery where they need to do an initial small project and you get a better idea of what's going on before you move to the retainer? Have you tried anything like that so far?
Yeah, we provide that as an option, but nobody has actually selected that option. But I think I think you're onto something here, because maybe we need to promote that as our preferred engagement.
I would take it even a step further and say this is the next step.
Okay.
So you do the initial conversation to see if they're even a match at all. And then the follow-up is they're getting, in a sense, a proposal for the paid discovery, which would be productized. I mean, obviously, the deliverable is custom to them, but there's a standard thing. And rather than saying it's preferred, you're like, no, this is the process. For instance, my sales process, I will not get on an exploratory call unless someone has filled out my pre-intake questionnaire, share about goals, where they've been, where they want to go, that kind of thing. Because I know that if people haven't invested 15 minutes to fill out the survey, why should I invest 45 minutes in a sales call? So the idea there would be they have to commit to spend a few $1,000s. It could be 10,000. It could be more. It could be as low as, say, $1,000. They're proving by spending some money that they're willing to spend more money, or at least if they aren't willing to spend a little bit, they're less likely to spend more.
Right.
And so I would for sure present it as this is our process. You're going to need to do some testing the first few do. But Kate has shared in chat my article on paid discovery to give you some ideas on that. The other thing that comes to mind when you mention that people disappear, in an ideal world, there is some sort of a commitment from the client about discussing the proposal. Some agencies like to present the proposal live and then they send it afterwards. I lean more toward pre-arrange a call to discuss the proposal and then send it so they have it a few days beforehand. As an introvert, I like to take things in, and a detail-oriented person, I like to review things and then ask questions. The idea of like, you can't see it until you come to the presentation. I'm like, well, I don't know if I'm willing to come to the conversation, but I'd like to read all of the details first. Kind of like, I did an event over the weekend where you had to sign like a safety waiver. It's like, I'd prefer to read the whole thing in advance rather than while you're standing there. Right. So there's a question about, I wouldn't just email it to them. If you do email it to them, it needs to be contingent on their agreeing to a conversation about it.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
The other thing that I'm wondering about, and this is true for everyone listening, and by the way, if you have figured out a good way to prevent getting ghosted in your sales process, please share it in chat. Would love to hear from you what is working well for you. The final thing that comes to mind is whether the right people are at the meeting in the first place. So for instance, my work is with agency owners, or the owners hire me to work with their leadership team. So in that case, the decision makers are fairly clear. Depending on the size of your client, it's sometimes ambiguous. What do you currently do now, Nick, around sorting out who is required to be at each of the meetings?
Yeah, I think we had this issue early on, and I think we fixed it since. Now we only talk to CEOs or VPs of marketing who have responsibility for the P&L. So it's we've narrowed down to the decision makers who are authorized to hire a marketing agency. So the right people are on the call, but I think I think they're intimidated, or maybe not intimidated, but they're maybe taken aback by the pricing. I think we're asking for too much. That being said, some of our clients who started on smaller retainers and have escalated since are now with us for a long time, and we have actually very high retention rates.
Right.
So I think you're onto something with that initial onboarding package or a discovery package to build the comfort so they can trust our process, so they can trust working with us.
Yes.
And then it's easier.
And you can also decide, do you want to work with them too? If their whole situation is shambolic, you have to decide, or do you want to get into this? One other thing, though, that will help reduce the ghosting, it'll reduce also the number of proposals you do in the first place, is give them a clearer idea of the potential range. And it could be
Yeah.
a big range. You could say, here's our process. You fill out this pre-questionnaire. We do an exploratory call. If that thing seems like a match, then we do this, then we do this. There's, don't call it paid discovery, but there's an initial audit or initial plan or, this or that analysis. And from that, we'll identify a recommended budget range or a few ranges. As a preview, when we've done work like this before, the budget range has gone from 10,000 a month to 50,000 a month. We know that's a big range. We'll have a better idea once we do the initial engagement. That way, when you say it's 10,000 a month and they're like, that's all the money I have in the world, you had an idea of that beforehand. My experience is that when prospects have dramatically less money than the budget, they're usually going to volunteer it. They're like, ooh, well, I only had 2,000 a month. And then you can decide what to do. How do you approach budget currently in the conversations?
Yeah, usually I mention it in the first conversation. I mention ranges in the first conversation. It's frustrating because we've been told that our people would like to go for a certain package, let's say one of the higher packages, and then they still ghost us. So I'm not sure if it's not the price, what is it?
I think the question also becomes one of the links we shared in chat for here in the live event is the idea of my Crux sales qualifying framework. It's similar to BANT, B-A-N-T, budget, authority, need, and timing. X adds the idea of the X factor, which is like, how does it feel? Does it seem like things are a match, or is there something that seems a little off? And it's worth paying attention to that. For instance, to consider, and for everyone listening, it's going to vary by agency. Basically, are there red flags that apply to your agency? And actually, for those listening, what are your red flags at your agency that when you notice them in the sales process? No. For instance, I'll only work with agencies that have 1, 2, or 3 owners. My experience is that if there are 4 or more owners, it's guaranteed drama, and I do not want to be part of that. So you've probably seen some. Share your red flags. Before we move on to the next question, I see we have some comments in chat. I know, Mark, you asked, do you discuss budget before proposing? If there's a huge mismatch on budget that can lead to ghosting. Agreed that if there's a huge mismatch on budget, they might disappear. The ideal, though, is that they agree that their budget is within the range. Usually, if people are dramatically lower, they're usually going to volunteer it. So in that case, you can actually skip doing the proposal and you save time, both time on the proposal, but also the emotional investment of thinking that it was going to work out. Patrick noted, never email it to them, let them know you have to explain each line item to them and so on. That definitely can work. The key thing here is you need to go with the process that works for you, whether it's you present it and email it afterwards, if that's a fit for your approach and your culture, or from your agency culture perspective, send it in advance, but only if they've agreed to the conversation. And if they won't agree to a conversation and they won't agree to bring certain people to the conversation, I would recommend that you don't move forward with the proposal. Or if they've agreed to certain people being at the meeting and they don't show up because they're too busy, that is a strong sign of it not working out, or worse, you get started and then things blow up later. The executive who skips that early meeting, but then suddenly shows up at the end of the engagement, or maybe early in the retainer, maybe at the end of the strategy phase, and they show up and they have some negative feedback and leave you to deal with the problem. The technical term for that is swoop and poop. Kate, if you don't mind sharing our article on swoop and poop, that can be a problem. And agreed, Patrick, if they only want you to email it and not do anything further, yeah, they're definitely shopping around on price, and that's absolutely not a good fit. I like the idea, Patrick, of giving them a calendar scheduling link in the call, so then if you need to sort out alternative times, kind of deal. All right, so If you have any other things that are red flags for you, please share them in chat to help Nick and to help everyone else. I see we have vague filling out of the form, being late for the first meeting. My approach, by the way, here's a final bit, Nick, as we wrap up and move to the next question, which is this: if you've ever had a prospect that is late for a sales meeting, right? You're on the line, it's the appointed time. Ideally, you've sent them a reminder, whether manually, automatically, or both, and they're not there. They're ghosting you on the call that you've scheduled. What do you do? Well, consider doing what I do, which is once it's 5 minutes in, I confirm. Well, I mean, a couple minutes in, it's like, am I on the right link? Yes, that's usually the case. Then 5 minutes in, double check for any emails, sometimes a bit sooner. Make sure that they haven't reached out, they haven't texted or emailed or otherwise. There may be some confusion. Okay. At 5 minutes, I draft an email in the latest thread and I say, hey, it sounds like something may have come up. I will be on the line until a quarter after. And if things have come up and you need to reschedule, let me know. Now, they're on thin ice. If usually what happens is people show up and they apologize and we go in, but like it's a yellow flag at minimum. If they don't show up at all and they've made no attempt to contact me, they need a pretty good reason for what happened. And sometimes, things happen. The key thing, though, is that by saying it, roughly 5 minutes in, sending the email that I'll be on until, 15 minutes in, and that's that. That way you don't have to wait on the line forever. And that gives them additional time if something did truly come up and, whatever is going on. So that's my recommendation. By 5 minutes in, write that email saying you're going to be on there, until 15 minutes in, and then you're gone. But for sure, you need a good explanation for why. All right. Well, Nick, thank you for joining. Appreciate the question.
Thank you.
Next up, we have a question from Maria in Nova Scotia. So here is her question. I'm going to talk through my advice and go from there. And certainly, if you have any follow-up questions on this, feel free to share in chat. So here is the question. Maria in Nova Scotia asked, what client policies should we put in place to prevent scope creep? Great question. Well, a few things come to mind. One of the questions is around what is billable, what is not billable. For instance, do you bill for travel if you're meeting with a client in person? Do you bill for things that you need to buy elsewhere? What's the markup? You definitely want to get that nailed down. Do you bill for a 5-minute phone call? I'd recommend rounding that 5-minute call up to a quarter hour as you're tracking your time. What triggers a rush rate versus being at your regular rate? You always have the option of waiving certain fees or certain upcharges, but it helps if you have the upcharge in place in the first place. So you could say, for instance, normally there's a 50% rush surcharge to get things done faster. In this case, you asked for it by Friday. Under our normal schedule, we wouldn't have it for you until the middle of next week. But we had some extra time and we were able to get it done sooner. We're waiving the rush fee this time. The key thing is you need to call it out. It needs to be strategically free. We had some extra capacity. We like working with you. We're giving you a deal rather than just doing it. I had a situation as a director of client services where a client submitted something to the agency. They submitted a request through our project management system, as they were supposed to do. And one of our team members jumped on it and he immediately made the update. Unfortunately, there was a problem. The client had not agreed to pay for that update yet. So I had to go back to my team member and ask him to roll back the change until I could get the client to agree to pay for it. He took initiative. That was good, but unfortunately was doing, unpaid work. Good news, the client confirmed. I gave them a quote on the update. I certainly knew exactly how long it was going to take because it had already happened. And ultimately, the client agreed, and then I had him deploy it. So, rush rate or not, that's a factor. One of the big ones is rounds of revisions. I worked with an agency in Austin earlier this year where they were often going over budget, dramatically over budget, like 50 to 80% over budget. And I asked about how they approached rounds of revisions. And the answer was they didn't really have a policy around that. It was kind of whatever the client wants, the client gets. So no surprise that things were often running over. My recommendation was to identify for each set of milestones in the engagement, there are going to be a certain number of revisions. Common is 3 revisions, but 2 is okay as well. You need to find the approach that works for you, but ultimately, it's not unlimited. Now, there's an alternative way to budget for revisions, which is that they get a certain dollar budget or a certain number of hours or a certain number of points for revisions. So in that case, maybe they have, a tiny tweak here, a tiny tweak there, a tiny tweak there. You're pulling from the revisions budget rather than, tiny tweak is a major revision. But if you do charge for revisions on a number of rounds of revisions, make sure you clarify with the client that, to confirm any other changes, this is revision number 1 of 3. And then this is revision number 2 of 3. And this is the 3rd of the 3 revisions. If you have any other changes after this, we're glad to do it. But, an additional charge would apply. You want to make sure that the client isn't confused about what's included, what's not, because, they've probably forgotten what was in the original scope. Patrick, thank you in chat for the note about, you described it as a personality tax. I describe it as a nuisance fee, but that's if a client is particularly demanding, they may need to pay more because of the additional demands. I know Diane, my colleague, has mentioned sometimes had clients in the past where you just build it into the quote. They're going to be a challenge, and you just build that into the pricing. So if you have any follow-up questions about managing scope creep, feel free to share those in chat. And certainly good luck out there. It's scope creep is a challenging thing. Scope creep is normal. It's okay, but make sure you have a process to manage it, to make sure either you're getting paid for it through change orders, other out of scope situations, or the client is agreeing, oh, you know what, it's extra, I don't want to pay for it, never mind, let's move on. And indeed, yep, thank you in chat, making sure to discuss the work before you do it so that there is less confusion later. You want to avoid a situation that I had also as a director of client services where a client needed a number of things. And here's what happened. The client was like, we need this update. I said, great, we can do option A or option B. He picked option A. We did it. And then he said, after it was done, actually, we'd like to go with option B. I'm like, that'll be extra. He was like, yeah, that's fine. We did option B. And then sure enough, he said, you know what? My team would like to go back to option A. And so we did. But he was paying for every change. Building A, then building B, and then going back to A. So we did get paid for it. My team was not thrilled about that happening. But, we managed the scope. As wearing my project manager hat, I managed the scope. A couple other comments in chat before we move on to the next segment. Yes, using a change log to keep track of what is going on, whether that's formal or somewhat more informally, that makes sense. And yes, watch out for clients who think everything is easy. If you've ever had a client who said that everything is easy, they were probably gaslighting you, or they just don't know what they're doing. But either way, not a good situation. I had a client years ago who would say that whatever update he requested, it would take us 1 hour. He was highly confident that it would take us 1 hour to make the update. And I'd be like, let me review that. And I'd be like, well, It'll be 8 hours. We're billing at time and materials. And he's like, oh, I can do it myself. It's not really that complicated. It's easy. And I'm thinking, one, you can't do it yourself. And two, even if you could, you're asking us to do it. So that's the price. And he would pay it. But I was happy to not work with him anymore when the time comes. Instead of easy, by the way, train your team. Do not say that something is easy, because easy sounds like it's going to be free, or it should be free. Instead of easy, say that something is straightforward. Easy sounds free, straightforward sounds like at least $1,000. All right. Speaking of money, let's talk about how much money you would ideally be making as an agency owner. If you're an agency owner, part of the challenge of running a business is that you're in charge of everything, and you also set your own compensation. The question is, what is the right compensation? In my work as an agency consultant, I found that people are often underpaying themselves. It's a typical challenge. So let's talk a bit about some benchmarks about what is normal for agency compensation, or at least what is ideal for agency compensation. If you're based in the US and you'll want to adjust this for your relevant currency and market situation, if you're not, you ideally are paying yourself as an agency owner $100,000 to $500,000 a year in salary. You will have additional bits as well to your compensation. You're probably taking distributions, shareholder distributions, from 20 to 30% net profit margins. Can't take all of it because you're going to have to pay taxes, and you need to keep money in the business to run other things. But $100,000 to $500,000 in salary, a portion of distributions at a minimum to cover your estimated taxes, coming from your ideally 20 to 30% net profit margins. Some clients give themselves a sales commission, either on their sales efforts or on revenue in general. That's up to you. You also probably have some company benefits as well that the agency, that the business is paying for. Sometimes I see some extreme examples, like if you're a remote agency, you probably do not need a company car, a company paid vehicle. With all of this, talk to your accountant, talk to your tax planner, talk to your financial planner about what is right for you. Now, if you are less than that, or if you're less than the $100,000 to $500,000 range, or maybe you're in the range, but you want that to be more, well, what can you do to get that higher? Well, a few things to consider. I would start by considering that you apply to my Work Less, Earn More bootcamp. Oh, how does that work? Well, if you're interested in the bootcamp, keep an eye on the Sake as a Company email newsletter, and you'll get a heads up when applications are available. All right, well, the next up, we have a question from Adam in Portland. Adam, if you want to come on video, and let's get things started down here. We go. All right. Well, Adam, welcome.
Yeah, thanks.
So here's the question you had asked. To paraphrase, you'd asked, how much should we share with our team about company financials? If you could elaborate a bit on that question, and then let's dig in.
Yeah, so small agency with about 8 team members working like quarter time to half time, so contractors.
Yes.
And so I'm the only full-timer. And so until maybe 6 months ago, all that information came through me. And I did have a team member working with me on some strategy sessions. And as a project manager, he felt like he needed to know more about those sort of finances and what levers we had.
Absolutely.
And good stuff came from sharing that. Sharing, what clients were paying, and being able to have, some levers to move there. And so kind of the question that I have is, how much further should I go with that? And there are some spots where those numbers have made their way into places where the broader team could see it. And I felt like, oh, I want to pull that back. But then I saw what good came from sharing with one. So that's kind of the conundrum I have. And my concern there is that the broader team, and really even that project manager, doesn't have the full scope of the expenses side of that, which is, and the risk that there is with, paying people sometimes before client checks have come in, if it's net 60 or something, right? And all of those factors, and certainly the part where I'm trying to pay myself at levels that you just described in the last question. So
yes,
that's sort of the trade-offs that I'm trying to figure out here.
It's smart to be intentional about it rather than just, for instance, if you give a continuum, sharing everything or sharing nothing. Both of those are problematic. The ideal is somewhere in the middle. The question is, what's the right middle for you and your agency?
Yeah.
And, for everyone listening, you're going to be at different spots on that continuum between hopefully sharing more than nothing, but less than everything. So the fact that, for instance, you shared more with the project manager makes sense. As the project manager, part of their job is to manage the budget. They don't know what the budget is. They can't really manage it. But also, in terms of spending that budget, they need to know roughly what different people cost. They may not necessarily need to know the exact hourly rates of people, but for instance, is someone, mid, senior, or junior? Because ideally, part of what a project manager is doing, and Kate, if you could share our article on this, the idea of the cheapest competent available person, ideally, the PM, whether that's you as the project manager or someone as a dedicated project manager, assigning work to what I would call the cheapest competent available person. That is, they are competent to do the work, they are available to help, and if you've got more than one person who's competent and available, they have the lowest rate. Don't tell them you're the cheapest competent available person for this. That's kind of rude.
Yeah.
But the point is the PM needs to know roughly what people cost so that they can make decisions about how to deploy resources within the project. So PM definitely knowing about budgets makes sense. If someone is serving as a strategist, they need to know about client budget as well, because the strategist's job is to figure out how do we maximize the client's ROI based on their goals. So what's the highest return on investment? And if they don't know what the budget is, what the investment is, they don't have an idea of what they have to work with, right? Is the client spending $100,000? Are they spending $1 million? Are they spending $10,000? That impacts what strategy works. So what questions or reactions do you have so far on that?
Yeah, I think the biggest area where it has come up has been with those that are kind of delivering the creative. So we're primarily writing about technical topics for companies, and so there's kind of and we actually most don't work on an hourly rate. So you can actually see we charge client X and we pay person who did the bulk of the creative work. Forget there's also the project stuff and the editing and other things, but I could see from their perspective, the bulk of the creative work gets paid Y, and Y is significantly less than X, right?
And so, the point of an agency is you're buying labor at wholesale and marking it up to sell it at retail.
Yeah.
So some of that is normal. If someone's like, you paid me $100, how dare you charge it out at 300 or 500 or whatever? It's like, well, that's business. So if someone has a fundamental problem with you marking up their rates, they're not going to work. For instance, I know you're in Portland. I did an Amtrak train trip from Portland to Chicago several years ago, and in Minneapolis, met a guy who owned a construction company, and he mentioned his focus in the Minneapolis area was working on high-end home renovations. And he had a team member who was an amazing craftsperson. But problem was that that team member apparently hated rich people. Who's the target market for a high-end custom home renovation company? People who have perhaps a bit more money. And so ultimately, the construction company owner had to fire the guy or stop bringing him on projects because he didn't like the people he was working for. Right. And I guess they weren't evil villains or what have you. They just happened to have more money. Maybe they were closer to the $500,000 range on compensation or more. So if someone has a fundamental problem with you barking up their rates, that's not going to work. I would instead focus on saying to the individual team members, and this would be through the project manager, the budget for this is X hours. Mm-hmm. So if that works for sure, if you're paying the team member on an hourly basis, if you're paying the team member on a milestone basis, fixed scope, fixed cost, you would have some sort of discussion with them. They're internally thinking what it's going to take to get it done. They quote that to you. You still probably want to reinforce what the turnaround is, right? So say they get it, they're thinking it's 10 hours, they get it done in 1 hour, but they're paid flat rate. Ideally, they get it to you sooner rather than, say instead of 10 hours, it takes them 20. They need to manage your expectations about how long the duration is to get it done so that the PM can manage the client expectations. For instance, that team member that I mentioned earlier who jumped in and did the work before the client agreed to pay for it. I also had a challenge with him where I had assigned him a round, we were doing a brand identity package, initial logo concepts. And I said, here's, it's usual round 1, 10 hours. And we had a typical number of concept ideas to come up with. Here's a range. I get the result back. It's a lot more concepts than I expected. And I see that instead of 10 hours, he had logged 20 hours on it. It's like, I asked what had happened. He was like, well, I wanted it to look good. And I realized that as a designer, he was trying to create a portfolio piece and he, wanted more concepts to come up with a better portfolio piece.
Right.
And so we had to have a conversation. I said, I appreciate you want it to be better. And I'm glad to, support you as you're expanding your portfolio. Unfortunately, the client wanted it to be 10 hours good, not 20 hours good. And so in the future, we arranged if there was something where he wanted to over deliver, he had to do the additional over delivery outside of regular work hours. He also needed to give me a heads up so that I can manage the client's expectations to say, oh, we had some additional bandwidth. We've given you more than we normally would. So they don't expect it every time. Right. Logo work is, you're not doing a new logo for every client, the client every month kind of thing, but you want to manage expectations. So that also gets into if a team member has to manage the client's expectations about what's going on, the more they know about budget, the better.
Yeah. So on project or account managers being able to provide that information and they have more insight into all the different areas where the money could go. So they're less likely to say, oh, wow, I'm in a bad position here and what I'm being paid based on this, because they see all the full breadth of it.
And indeed, at many agencies, the account managers get some sort of a percentage around, maybe it's a percentage for upsell or thing like that. Right. So in that case, they're going to know exactly what the client is spending, because part of their job is to find ways for the client suitably to spend more. So, I guess the theme is project management and account management. It makes sense for them to know what the budget is. Now, there's a question in general about the team knowing about how the agency is doing in general in terms of overall revenue, profits, things like that. If someone is a contractor, you're probably going to share less with them about what's going on. On the other hand, if you have an all hands meeting and it includes primarily employees, it's normal to share, like, here are our financial results right now, or at a minimum, at least what the revenue is.
Right.
Of course, labor is the most expensive expense at any agency. Ideally, if you think about your services revenue, spending something like 50 to 60% of that revenue all in on labor, and that includes owners and ongoing contractors as well as any employees. If you're spending more than that on labor, your margins are going to be lower, and if you're spending less on labor, your margins will be higher. Though, if your net profit margins are dramatically above 30%, agencies tend to be understaffed, and everyone is overworked. So, in that case, it's typical to share about revenue trends, and maybe sort of an idea about where labor fits in. The challenge with all of this is if you start sharing more, if you do say open book accounting, where you're sharing just about everything, once you start, you can't stop. So if you're having a bad quarter or a bad year, you need to tell people. I'm pretty open with my team about finances because part of their work is to help grow the business and help us support agencies profitably as they grow profitably. So in that sense, the more they know, the better they can support me. So for sure, anyone in an operations role at the agency should know about overall finances. And of course, if you have someone external as a salesperson, they're going to know what clients are paying as well.
Right.
So what's your takeaway from all of this?
I think it's continue to share with the project team, and I think probably still to figure out to not just let the stuff sort of slip out accidentally. Like we need to lock down some of that information just so it's not discovered accidentally. And then I think, to your point, think intentionally about how it's shared.
That makes sense. Being intentional, and this is kind of a situation where if there's something you're opting not to hide, or if there's something you're opting to hide or to not disclose, keep in mind that if someone does find it, it's going to hurt even more when they find it. For instance, I was speaking at a conference years ago. I was doing a 5-minute lightning talk, 5 or 10 minutes. And one of the organizers was like, "Oh, Carl, will we see you at the speaker dinner?" And I was like, I wasn't invited to the speaker dinner. I assume because I was doing a lightning talk rather than, at the time, a breakout or a keynote. And it turns out that, I had not been invited, but I would have rather not have known that I was not invited. That wasn't ideal. And indeed, comment from Andrea in chat. One option is if you use blended rates that, help sort out, where to deploy people. I am a fan of doing variable rates. That is, maybe there's a senior rate, a junior, a mid, and maybe, an owner rate that's a lot higher. In that case, it's okay for the project manager to know what the rates are, whether one blended or variable, to help figure out how to deploy people. So,
right. Yeah.
Adam, thank you for joining today, and good luck as you sort through all of that.
Yeah, thanks.
Well, our final question for today is from John Mark in Oklahoma. John Mark, if you want to come online, let me grab here. Okay. And let's see, get this sorted. Just one moment. All right. There we go. And all right, success. Well, John Mark, thank you for joining.
Thank you, Carl. Appreciate you having us.
Absolutely. Well, to paraphrase, I'll paraphrase your question and then you can share a bit more, and then we'll dig in as the final question for today. You asked, how should agencies manage the handoff process between sales and the delivery team? That is, sales and then your account managers, project managers, and so on. If you could elaborate a bit about your situation and the question, and let's answer it.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate your time with this. So my role within our company is really more the sales and then the initial strategy. So I probably should have clarified a little bit further, saying that it is from sales to strategy and then to the handoff.
Got it.
And after reading some of your blogs, I've realized that I'm a pretty horrific project manager. And so that I would love some of your insight on how to just improve that handoff to our account management team, project management team, even though we don't really use those terms internally. I think we probably should from now on. But one of the main issues that we have is long sales cycles. And so we establish a relationship, sometimes over the course of a year from a sales, and then we do a 1 to 3 month strategy, or typically a 3 to 6 week strategy, and then the handoff. And people tend to sort of revert back to the person that they're most familiar with. So I would be delighted to hear your insights on this.
Yeah. Well, so if we think about this, as we've shared in chat and I've shared previously, there are 6 agency roles, and, it's normal to be wearing multiple hats. So, as a reminder, if people haven't seen that slide before, you've got account management, keep the clients happy, sell them more. Project management, about managing the work smoothly and profitably, usually internal, but could be facing publicly as well. Then you've got your subject matter experts, your SMEs, that would be your designers, developers, copywriters, that kind of thing, focusing on their craft all day long. You've got your strategists who are focused on client strategy, maximizing the ROI of the client budget based on whatever their budget is, get them the best results possible. You've got biz dev, which, John Mark, it sounds like you're wearing those hats. It's technically 3 things: marketing, sales, and partnerships. And then finally, support. That's about agency operations and leadership. So in this case, it sounds like you're wearing the biz dev hat, sales. You're also the strategist, but then you're handing it off to someone else as an account manager and or project manager. Is that right? Okay.
That is correct. Yes, thank you.
And it sounds like you mentioned people tend to revert back to the one they're most familiar with. I mean, indeed, this is totally common. Say you had a separate salesperson, it would be normal for clients to go back to the salesperson to talk about stuff, even though ideally you would want the salesperson to be out selling more. And part of this, and this is true for everyone listening, you want to manage clients' expectations about what happens. Clients tend to like the salesperson because salespeople tend to be likable people. And clients tend to connect with them. You don't want a situation where the client loves the salesperson and then suddenly finds at the kickoff meeting that the salesperson isn't there and they're never going to see them again. That's not good. And indeed, the salesperson, whether that's you as the owner or a separate salesperson, should be checking in with clients occasionally throughout the engagement to make sure things are going as expected. But ideally, the kickoff meeting is the last time they see the salesperson on a day-to-day basis, and that's that. But part of what you can do wearing your sales hat is build up the account manager, right? Say, we've got an amazing account manager who'll be taking care of you. You may have multiple, but like this is the one who's, assigned to their account. They've got a project manager who's supporting them behind the scenes. Ideally, the client is meeting at least the account manager prior to the kickoff meeting. Now, the risk there, of course, is that you don't know if the client's going to move forward or not. But if it's at the point where, say, you've presented the proposal, you have a pretty good idea if they're a match or not, ideally the account manager is involved. And if you don't do that, then at least record that meeting. The AM watches it. The AM is following up with the client to schedule the kickoff and get things coordinated so that they aren't some random person at the kickoff meeting. The key with that is that you need to manage the expectations of the client about what's going to happen. You could say, once we sort out the final details, finalize the scope, the account manager takes over, right? You're shifting it to the account manager. They lead the kickoff process. Now, I'm going to be at the kickoff meeting to make sure if there are any questions, we can sort that out very quickly rather than having to do a separate conversation. And then I, as the salesperson, will check in with you occasionally. So it might be, for instance, 1 week, or maybe, check in right after the kickoff, make sure that went as they expected, maybe a week later, and then maybe a month later, and then maybe a few months after that, that kind of thing. You need to find the right cadence. But in this case, it sounds like the handoff is from sales to you as the strategist. If you think of it, though, as a process that'll help if you want to slot someone else in for some of these roles in the future. Question, John Mark, is the account manager involved at all in the strategy process?
That's a great question. It depends is really the answer. It depends on the type of client that we have. But I love what you're saying about bringing in the account manager prior to the sale even closing, just on a 30-minute check-in.
Yeah.
Just say, hey, this is what it will look like if we move forward. Like I said earlier, some of these sales processes take a year. And so it's just a real slow going from that standpoint.
Part of it is introducing clients to what it's like to be a client of your agency. Even if they've worked with agencies before, and ideally they have, they don't know what it's like to be a client of your agency. So you want to let them know who's the ideal person to talk to get the fastest answers. So in this case, it may be sales. Maybe they meet the account manager, so at least they can put a face to the name. Maybe you do the strategy work for 3 to 6 weeks, and then toward the end of that, you're transitioning there. I think some of that's going to depend on your team's time and availability and things like that. But those are some things to think about. The main thing with all of this is put yourself in the client's shoes. They meet someone from the agency. Anyone from the agency, from the client's perspective, is the agency. So if the salesperson says something, makes a promise, it needs to get into the paperwork or it needs to be listed as a sales exclusion. We talked about this before. It didn't make it into the final scope. Please initial here. So there's not the confusion later. And then ultimately looking ahead to sort out, okay, then we do this, then we do that. And it's going to take some experimentation as you sort out what's the right process. But just the fact that you're being intentional about it rather than careening from one client to another is a good sign. As we wrap up, any follow-up questions on that, John Mark?
I really love put yourself in the agency shoe or in the client's shoes. Anyone from the agency is the agency. I think that's a great way of framing that. Super helpful in just making this a clear-cut process. I think it's awesome. Thank you, Carl.
Absolutely. Thank you, John Mark. And a takeaway for everyone is, if you have team members meeting with your clients, you probably want to sit in on some of those meetings occasionally, or maybe ask them to record it and you watch it later. I had a client who had a director leave and he started sitting in on the team meetings and he found surprised about some of the things that were going on there. So, I'm not saying go to every single meeting, but maybe it's, one meeting a month or one a quarter or something like that, just so you know what is going on. Fewer surprises later tends to be a good thing. I mean, nice surprises are nice, but usually when you're not paying attention to what's going on, it's usually a bad surprise rather than a nice one. Well, that wraps up Agency Office Hours for October 2021. If you have a question you'd like to ask in a future event, you're welcome to include that when you RSVP. I'll let you know in advance if I'll be answering your question live. We have the full schedule available at the Sakis & Company website for registering for the future event. Thank you so much for being here. Carl Sakis, agency consultant. I will see you again next time. Thanks, everyone.